Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him, and I am on a podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. And today I am delighted to be joined by Simon. Simon Sparks, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. I'm Simon Sparks, he, him. I am still on a quest to figure out what it is I'm going to be when I grow up. So I guess so. For the time being, I am a culture consultant. So that's as easy as I
Culture
can.
consultant. Does that mean
Yeah,
that you get little petri dishes and
absolutely.
agar?
I just make yogurt.
You just make yogurts.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but I mean, seriously. I mean, this is obviously this became a thing in games. I would argue, as in not, it's always been a thing, but it became something that people started talking about seriously. In my career's observation, when Ilka talked about Supercell very,
Yeah.
very, very early on in the sort of 2011, 12, that kind of era. I think it must have been 2012 because the first time I heard him really reinforcing the Supercell mindset
Mm-hmm.
was after he did his fantastic talk about Heyday and Clash of Clans and the prior game
Yeah,
Gunshot.
yeah.
But obviously he's not the only person who's been talking about this. There's been lots of people who've been making a kind of big deal about it. Now, if you're an indie dev, you've probably heard about this culture thing. If you worked at a big studio, you've probably seen 5 bullet point words on a big PowerPoint or plastered on the walls of a building. That's all culture is, isn't it?
Well, no, no,
Sorry.
absolutely not. So I would, so I think if we just sort of zoom out a bit for like a minute. So rather than
Yeah.
getting too specific about like things right now, I think just sort of zoom out a little bit, um, and think that, yes, Ilka, he's a fantastic human. I've never met him,
Yeah.
but I've seen him talk lots,
I
and
still occasionally, well, last time I saw him, I was still getting hugs. So I've known him for a
good.
very long
So
time.
he and
Yeah.
I'm a really big fan of Supercell and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, like keep zooming out. Like there are more. There's more than just the games industry. There are just wider
100%.
things. And I think with all of this stuff, language is super important. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it's the thing that people hang their hats on, and it's also the thing that means that we get too involved in the semantics of it all, and then we get lost in it. So often people do subscribe to or describe culture as, well, here are our values and these are the words that describe these things, and what they forget often is about like the behaviors attached to them, and then also how they stress test them and how they actually live by them, and what are the behaviors attached to it, what are the anecdotal things. And I think we were just talking beforehand that so much of this is, lots of people describe it as like your unwritten rules and everything, and I like to think of it more as in it's about like the intentional behaviors of groups of people like towards something. So
I love that. Yeah.
so
That's exactly how I feel. Yeah. Whether it's intentional, the question in my head, I guess a little bit. I do think it's intention in there. I just wonder how much of it is subconscious or implicit
I
through
guess, yeah,
practice.
I guess the intentionality behind it comes from just you vocalizing and talking about it,
Yeah.
and pointing it out, and pointing out
Yeah.
good examples of behaviors that you want to reinforce. But it's also only as good as the behaviors that the worst
Yeah.
behaviors you tolerate. So people can
Yes.
have lots and lots of aspirational words on walls, and
Yeah.
here is our, and they'll have diagrams and flywheels and lovely pictures of them, and say like, we value transparency and leadership and curiosity and courage and all these things, everybody goes, well, yeah, of course I agree with all these things, these are great, like why would you not, like but actually, can you find stories that back them up? Can you see this? Can you see small things every day that sort of like do this?
And
Can
what
you see?
happens when somebody exhibits those behaviors?
Yeah.
Do
Do
they
you get
get
a promotion? Do
rewarded?
you get paid more?
Yeah.
Do you, can you? And often we look for like the big, we look for like the really big sort of examples of this, and you look towards sort of traditionally, you'll look towards sort of studio leadership and just go, yes, they embody this, and they are sort of,
Yep.
I'm embodying our, you know, behaviors right now. I'm saying we are people first, and we do this, and then they go and restructure the whole company because they've made terrible decisions and whatever,
Yeah.
and you just go, how people first are you being here right now? I'm not quite sure. Like,
Well, this is the sort of tragedy in some ways, is that a lot of people aspire to those things, but when the economic climate changes or a deal falls through, there's some level of pragmatism that happens, and sometimes that pragmatism is delivered effectively in line with those core
yes,
beliefs,
yeah,
and sometimes the core beliefs are thrown away because of the convenience or the lack of convenience, for want of a better phrase. I'm
yeah.
trying to be a little fairer on people who make bad decisions, but I don't want to let them off the hook at the same time.
No, I look completely. It's not something you should go around. And again, we're being very general with all of
We
this
are.
stuff. Yeah, right. So we're being, you know, and it's very easy to look at this as if, like, you know, you're beating people with a stick and being like, you know, you aren't what you say you are. Like, you're not sincere, so I'm going to hit you with this stick and I'm going to do that. But
Yeah.
equally, we're all. I think the thing that we don't ever really talk about is just what a bunch of crazy misfits like we all are as human beings, and that we're all flawed and like
Yep.
weird and bizarre, and I'm still flabbergasted as to how you get any group of people together and actually get them to do anything in
Mm.
sequence. Like, you know, it
It's
takes
bizarre,
really,
isn't it?
yeah, it takes real intentionality and, like, you know, behind that. So yeah, I'm always fascinated with all that stuff. But yeah, I don't want to get too broad and like be too armchair professory and sort of academic about it, because those generally tend to be some of my tendencies, when because I spend a lot of time researching
Yeah.
and I've done lots of work with lots of interesting groups of people inside games and outside of
Yeah.
games, and I which I think is really valuable, because
Yeah, I agree.
I have to take my head out of games to get a different perspective, like a lot.
I'm terrible at that because I literally live,
You are
breathe,
very much
exist.
defined by
I am very much defined by a hat and game. But okay, let's go back. I mean, that being said, I have worked in other environments. So I'm thinking, you talked about this being, I don't want to say solved problem, but a known process. And I think it particularly becomes obvious of how important it can be when we're dealing with organizations at significant scale. So I'm taken back to a place where you see some of the worst disasters of attempts to do culture, but equally, I kind of, this is why I'm maybe a bit forgiving, is because I've seen why they've had to make some of these kind of cutthroat kind of approaches to culture. And I'm thinking about telcos. So I worked at British Telecom, I worked at Three, the mobile operator, and Three in particular spent an awful lot of time investing very early on with everyone who's brought on board with certain cultural references and certain value statement, and again defining what values were for the company and how we would not just have that exhibited in terms of like the branding, which to be fair they did try to do, and also through operational processes. But of course, then middle management do exist, and obviously, it's not always the case that your middle management will be good at keeping to the values,
Mhm.
and politics and fiefdoms come into play. Like you say, crazy human beings come into play, so it becomes complicated. So, I mean, given the kind of history of like traditional IT and telco kind of organizations, maybe not always having the best track record in culture, but having recognized its importance, do you think there's any lessons in that kind of space that we can take from in terms of our crazy games world?
No, of course, yeah. I mean, you can also like I really, you know, believe on standing on the shoulders of giants, and and they don't have to necessarily be great examples. They can be things that you just learn from, and you know,
Mm.
and go, oh, we shouldn't do that, and shouldn't do that. So, but I just want to hit on a couple of points that you just sort of my ears sort of, or my sort of spidey senses that started tingling.
Go for it.
Like there's still this sort of notion of trying to do culture, and
Yes.
I think about this a lot, and it just is a thing that exists.
Yes.
It's not something that you go, we are doing culture or we are not. Like it is happening. Like it's just happening. It's the sort of behaviors that sort of get groups of people to do stuff essentially.
Yes.
So whether you note them down or not is something, that's not a case of, oh, we wrote them down, so therefore we're doing culture, or we're now taking them into consideration with our operational practice, we're doing culture. It just is happening.
Yeah.
So, and I really would like people to think more about culture as like a strategic pillar, like it's actually your strategy for getting stuff done.
Yes.
Then start thinking about like, well, what's the company that you want to build, and what's the team you want to build? Like, what is your sort of mission, and what is it the thing? What is not to be too naff about it, but what's your North Star? Like, what's the thing that how are you going to operate in the future in order to be really successful? And I don't think we ask ourselves this enough in games. We sort of go, well, we're just going to make a successful game and then it'll all be great.
Yeah.
And actually, what we don't think about is like, well, what's the, start from this vision of like what you think success is going to look like. How real do you think it is, and work backwards from that. And pretty much you can get down to this, every company is just a decision making machine. So you go, well, okay, well then what are the things that are going to help us make decisions? And
Yep.
what are the things that are going to help us make decisions? And for a very long time, people thought, well, we need data. We need more data around this. And you just go, well, now we've got enormous amounts of data about everything, and yet we still can't make decisions. So, or we have ambiguity around them, or we can't make them fast enough. So it's like, oh, actually, what we need to think about, well, how are we making decisions fast with incomplete data? Like, what's it, and sometimes people go, well, it's my gut feel or whatever. And you can start to break that down into characteristics and those sorts of things. So I would encourage people to think about the sort of simplicity of stuff like that, like more than
Yep.
anything else, is just being like, well, can you get everybody on the same page to go like, well, we base our decisions on like a set of rules that like we have, and those will change, and they can either be the sum of the parts of what you have, or they can be things that you just go, well, some of that's missing now, but we're working towards it. So I think about that sort of stuff a lot. And for instance, the work that I've been doing recently over the last couple of years, alongside games, has been work for the UK Navy. The UK Royal Navy.
Okay.
And they had three sort of like, pillars that they wanted to like instill within the whole of the Navy, which was grow the ability to challenge effectively, get comfortable working in less hierarchy, and grow the ability to communicate like between ranks. That was everything
Yeah.
they wanted
And
to
there's
achieve.
doctrine behind those reasons to act as well, I imagine.
Yeah. So I think for like a small developer, a small group of people, I really believe that small teams of people can do amazing things. And we'll probably cite this a lot, but look at Supercell. Like Supercell's got 100 people that work there, but the teams that make the games are very small.
Yeah.
They're very, very small teams, and they try and give everybody the right levels of autonomy and mastery and those sorts of things. So I think for small teams of people, when you think about your culture, think about the things that are going to help you make decisions, and not just wait for someone to tell you what to do, and not wait for someone to say like, well, here is everything we are going to do to do.
Yeah.
So
I mean, so I remember Shahid Ahmad, who was formerly at Sony and has done a lot of indie stuff and talked a lot about his own mental health as it happens, did a fantastic talk in Jordan one time talking about culture. And he focused very much on the culture is the leadership. Now, I'm not sure I entirely kind of necessarily think that's absolutely always the case, but I mean, it's not far from the truth. But what I think that says to me, in light of what you're saying, is when we start thinking about the intentionality about how we're going to apply this decision making process, one of the things we have to consider is who we are as leaders, what we're trying to achieve as leaders, and how we want that to be followed through by the members of the team that represent our
Yeah, yeah,
interests. Is
yeah.
that a good way to put it?
Yeah, yeah, I do think, especially when you are starting new companies and new
Mm,
teams, like they often will be the sort of the lightning rod or the beacon or the thing that they should be the best examples of.
yeah,
Really, I think you should really. I think I do feel strongly that those early foundational steps are a lot around sort of like what the leadership embodies and the founders embody, and um, so I do think that's super important because it does have this ripple effect out and everything. But I do think there is the other side. Well, a lot of this sort of what it eventually gets to is is just this idea of self awareness. Like,
yeah,
I think the more self aware that leaders are and leadership teams and that they can be, like that will only help improve that will only help improve them. And to give a bit more detail on that, there's more when you think about well, self-awareness isn't something that like you just have. It's something that is like sharpened over time, and
yeah,
it's something that you have to continually sort of like and the best way of describing self-awareness really is being like, well, what is it that's influencing like how I perceive the world right now? So what are the factors that are coming in? So and we've all had stories of sort of like there's been like a boss has come in, they're obviously in a bad mood, they're in a terrible mood, and you've been like, well, I probably better not go and sort of tell them about this thing right now, better hold off on that. And actually there are, and that's, that feeds into this whole thing of sort of like too much optics around everywhere. Whereas people who are really self-aware and are able to articulate how they think and feel and are able to park it, or you're far more willing to go and talk to them about like hard stuff, about stuff that hasn't gone right,
mm.
about stuff that you may have dropped the ball on, or like or you're worried about.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's like a big part of all of this. I might not be
This is an
explaining.
interesting one because it's one of the things that I really didn't like about some of the culture training that we had at three, but I also do understand its value. And one of the phrases was the principle of the shadow you cast. So the awareness of the shadow you cast as you act. Now, on its surface, I like this way of thinking. So, if you think about the impact, and I know I've noticed it particularly in me as I've become more burnt out, my ability to appear positive has been diminished. I sometimes come across as annoyed when I'm not. I'm genuinely not. I'm just thinking, and the burnout means I come across as angry, and I'm aware of that, and I'm trying to stop that. But the reality is that sometimes that is a shadow that you cast, and being aware of that is great. However, unfortunately, in a big telco, it was often kind of misappropriated as a way of saying it's your fault. You could have fixed it, rather than and don't get me wrong, we should always look at the role that we play in the tasks that we have.
Yeah.
But if it becomes a blame process, it kind of undermines the whole thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes me think a lot about psychological safety, right? And a lot of
Mm,
people think that, like, oh, great culture means great psychological safety. Absolutely
yeah.
true.
Mm,
Like it does. But like when you really think about what psychological safety means, um, and what it means at an individual level and then like group levels, is that we often talk a lot about psychological safety is something that has to like the environment has to be safe enough for me to then like do something or to take a risk or to be brave or courageous. And actually what you're sort of touching on is like there is a personal responsibility with it. There is a personal responsibility of
mm,
like, well, I have my part to play in building psychological safety in this book because it's an exchange, it's a two-way thing, it's
absolutely.
like a relationship. So, and I often think about this notion of like you can't you can't be brave unless you're scared. So,
Yeah, yeah. I get
so
it.
there's like there is like a prerequisite to like so the idea of waiting for things to be safe until you do something is like, well, you might be waiting a really long time. You have to sort of You have to take a risk. You have to
Yeah.
you have to increase your understanding of that boundary, and 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 I think that this, I think we misunderstand this, and I think we miss opportunities to for organisations and teams in particular, especially small teams, to sort of work on it and to work on
Yeah, I
this
mean, I think
idea of like just having more real conversations.
I think understanding that as a two-way street. I mean, for me as a leader, my responsibility is to let people feel invited into a safe context
Yeah,
to be able to have frank conversations. And I try my best to do that on the basis that I don't get out of that team member the best that they could be or the best input into my thinking process, which I need to be best at my job.
yeah,
You know, I think it's essential that I have that openness and that engagement. But I also am aware that if I expect people to know that that's safe, then I'm in cloud cuckoo land. Because I mean, I remember, because basically being in telcos and various other places, I was essentially trained to fear. I was bullied at three by two separate managers, one of whom I got fired, the other one I got displaced into another team.
mm.
But I had 13 different managers in that organization over 5 years. So, you know, I know what bad management can, but equally there were some guys in that department who were great, who I'm still friends with.
Yeah,
And so I don't want to kind of cast the wrong light. Telcos are not a terrible place to be, but they were not a good place for me to be. Actually, that's not fair. I actually did very well, but
like
you know what I'm
it
saying? It's
yeah, like there are just, you know, there are, but we're sort of getting into this sort of thing, this sort of nuance, or this sort of like of like people often get promoted to positions where they shouldn't be.
yeah,
Like whenever I go into larger teams of people and they say, like, predominantly if I go into a studio and I go into a bigger studio, they generally tend to, and they tend to have a leadership miscommunication
yeah,
and a sort of senior to middle management sort of like misalignment. And they will
yeah,
always have a group of them that then they all agree and they go, they shouldn't be managers. Can you help them be managers? I'm like,
yeah,
right, my job is not to help them be managers. My job is to help everyone around them make them better managers. And
yes.
it's a strange concept for people to like get their head
No,
around.
I get it.
And they're like, well, yeah, you can teach them good management processes and stuff like that, but you can go read a book about it. Like you don't need my
But
help.
also, we have had, and it's not just games. This is a big thing that was a major issue in IT generally, in most cool organizations, where we have a tendency to promote someone who is good at their job to make them a
Yes.
leader of people without remembering it's a different skill set.
Yeah. So I would ask, like the thing that I love to ask, and no one ever does this survey, and they are terrified by it, is going, right, ask everybody in your organization, especially if it's a big one, just go, who do you go to advice for and who do you not go
Yeah,
to advice for?
yeah,
And
not
just
bad.
do a survey of that. I mean, like the people you go to advice for are probably people like, number one, they will, my hunch, and a lot of data suggests this, although people don't do the survey, so like there is other data that at least for this, you generally tend to go to people for advice who give you like just the truth.
Yeah,
Don't sugarcoat it really. They just tell you. They just go, if I need advice, I go to them because they'll just tell me how it is. Um, and people you don't go to advice for generally tends to be people who either, well, they either are a terrible manager and they're just bad, and they just go, you go, I don't have a good relationship with them. We don't have good communication. They're always quite mean with what they say or how they say it, or it doesn't feel actionable. It doesn't feel like it's just or right, or just, you know, it feels, I don't feel as if I can do anything with it. It just doesn't go anywhere. Or people who just sugarcoat stuff, or just
and
don't, or they go, do you know what? I don't know their opinion. I don't know if I can trust them.
no. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why I so much enjoyed working with Finns in particular, because there's an absolute kind of, yep, this is it. My favorite one is usually, and I've said this loads of times, I'm sure you'll forgive me for saying it. He said that was shit, and he left me to it. Now, in some climates, you might think that was a bad thing, but he knew I knew how to fix it. I knew he knew I knew how to fix it,
Yeah,
and he just knew I would fix it.
yeah.
And that simplicity was what I needed at that time.
So, like, there was a comment you said something earlier, and you said something about like as a leader, and I know I have to help people.
Mm.
I have to, I have to help people feel safe. I have to help people do this. I
Yeah.
have to, live and breathe this. Sometimes you can overdo that, and
Mm.
it become
Yeah.
this strength overdone becomes like, and people go, you've often you're coddling people, like, and
Mm.
you end up doing like the shit sandwich stuff, and
I was going to go into shit sandwich next. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but like and then because what you're thinking about optics is that you're having to really think about like, oh, what am I going to say, how is it going to land, are they really is they are they are they going to take this the right way, hang on, maybe if I phrase it like this, and I just sort of, so you end up in this sort of cycle of optics, and then you never really say what it is that you really want to say, and
Mm.
actually you just trust people with like your opinion, and trust people with your standards more than anything else. And I
Yeah, I
really
mean, I
love
think,
the examples of stuff like that, of
yeah,
just going, it's shit. And
yeah,
then they go, but and that's it. And you knew in that moment, you were like, oh, they want more from me than this.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and they know I can do
But
it.
I think the important thing for me is differentiating between providing a safe space and being clear on what your expectations.
Yeah.
And I think that they can be different. And this is where the shit sandwich is so problematic. And this is why, of all the companies that I've struggled with, it's been generally the American teams I've worked in that have been the most difficult,
Mm.
because they'll tell you something nice, which is meaningless. They'll then tell you something that's honest, but often in a fairly cruel way. And then they'll tell you something else that's nice,
Yeah.
but is also meaningless. Well,
Yeah.
why did you bother?
Yeah. Telling me that. Yeah.
Um,
Because
and it was
that's
so
all.
much so that I was just going to say, it was so much so that even in video, where I had a really, really good boss, but I was so used to having negative American management that it took me forever to trust that he was going to be okay with me,
Mm.
which is a crazy thought, really, isn't it?
Well, yes and no, but again, it goes back to the whole like we're all misfits, and we're all just sort of
Yeah,
like, yeah, we're all shaped by our experiences and shaped by everything. And this is when it comes. This is when you get like into the real nuance of like culture and like
yeah,
interrelationships between managers and teams and peer sharpening, and
yeah,
giving people voices so everybody feels that they can speak up, and high expectations and stuff, because all this stuff comes out in in the wash, and they go,
mm,
because when you eventually get down to, well, why were you holding back, or what was it that was stopping you, and people feel sort of safe enough to take that risk and talk about it, they go, it's, and you kind of don't know, and you go like, I feel like this, and I think it's tied to all this stuff, and you just go, okay, all right, I get that, like, but like, we're not that, and I think just getting that awareness around those
yeah,
things makes you go, okay, so the next time I feel like this, the next time I have this little bit of anxiety around it, I'm like, oh, okay, hang on a minute. You start to you
mm,
I think you can start to record like the patterns around this. So then
yeah,
you start to record the patterns around it. You can go like, all right, well, then it gives you an idea as into what might be getting in the way of me being a really good teammate right now. What might
mm,
be the thing that gets me in the way of being a really good decision maker? What's the
mm,
thing that gets me in the way of that? And then you can start looking at that and going, all right, well, how can I help you fix that? And that's where all
yeah,
this coaching comes in, and stuff. And you go, well, I like to think of it in terms of like a rep or like a practice, and go,
yeah,
okay, how can we find a safe way to get to get a to help you with this. So an example of this, it was someone I worked with, Teresa. She was an amazing German national DevOps engineer, and she wanted to be an SRE, and I think she's a senior SRE now at a sort of quite big corporate. Anyway, um, English not her first language. Going through this coaching course, trying to identify like the small behaviors that stop people being honest with you. And we got into this conversation, and we were speaking, and she really wanted people just to take her a little bit more seriously. And she says, I just don't feel confident. I don't feel as if people take me seriously and everything. And one thing that we noticed were every time she spoke, every time she interjected, or every time she started a sentence, it started with an apology. And she was constantly going, I'm really sorry, but can I just say, I'm sorry. Oh, do you mind if I just. So, and everything started with that. And I was like, do you think maybe this gateway, because she's having to translate into English, so
Mm.
she's developed a gateway phrase to enter a conversation, but then that's just become this habit. And I'm like, is that an intentional habit? Is that something you wanted to do or not? And she's like, no, not really, actually. And I was like, do you think maybe this might subconsciously have an effect, like on you or like someone else? It's like, okay, well, it's just like, I don't really know. It's like, well, let's come up with a bunch of experiments for you, just to so you get a handle on this, and so you don't, so you can just say your opinion confidently. So just put her to task, which is just going to coffee shops and ordering things and taking them back without apologizing. So just to give her an idea of like the feeling of just the nervousness around it, and being like, well, how did you get around that? How did you how did you change your behavior around that? And she was like, it was awful. And I said, but did anything bad happen? No. And then eventually that builds up, and then it builds up to times then you can start entering into work conversations with bosses and things like that, and go, all right, now you can start, now you've got an awareness of like your, this self-awareness of how you think and feel around this.
Yeah. And
You've
now she
got
can
to,
punch people without saying sorry. No, I'm joking.
yeah, poke them in the eye. So,
Yeah.
but it's often, people say, but I want to do this at work, and you go, you have to
Yeah.
take a step back, and you have to think of like a safe way of practicing this.
Yeah.
In order
And
to
I
get
think
into it.
that there's another aspect of that I think is important, which is there are a lot of people who don't feel that they're entitled to take up space,
Yes. Yeah.
especially if you're introverted, especially if you're ND in some way. Now, I'm the extrovert. I take up every ounce of space without thinking about it because I can't help myself. I wear a bloody hat for goodness sake. But there are a lot of people, especially in the industry, who seem to struggle with that process.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that and the impact that that has on these cultural endeavors that we have?
Oh, it's a big subject, that, isn't it? Like there is,
Yeah.
I mean, because you're looking at minority groups, you're looking at introvert, like everybody who, I remember having a conversation with my wife about this, and I said that I was in a room full of people, and I remember saying, I came home and I was like, I just felt so out of place. I felt like I didn't belong there. I felt like I didn't. She was like, yeah, that's everywhere I've ever been.
Mm.
I'm like, what? Really? How? And
Yeah.
so you start to think of it like, you're like, wow, that's something else. Um, I mean,
It's super tough, I know. Yeah.
it's very hard to just give like general advice like on
Yeah.
this stuff, because it's so specific. But I think the advice that I would give to anybody listening who does feel like that and struggles with this is that it's really focus on like your goal.
Yeah.
I know it sounds really naff, but it's like, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve, and what is it that you're trying to like? Are you trying to get stuff done? Like, what's the thing that you're doing for you? Like, and what's your goals and aspirations? And I think if you can just start to work backwards from that, and then you can
Yeah.
start to break down and have yourself set yourself small goals and small bits of momentum. And I think when it boils down, you get down to just understanding how to deal with discomfort. And I think if you can just practice small things every day, and I mean really small things every day, that just you start to build habits around
Mm.
understanding your own discomfort levels, because
Yeah.
that's a flexible thing, right?
Mm.
And it goes back to this thing of practice makes permanent. So if you're
Yeah.
not so, and I think of think of like our kids and everything. So I've got a 16-year-old and I've got an 18-year-old, and they've sort of they were growing up using smartphones, and they are now and and my behaviors are based on my smartphone and based on short iterations, short sort of attention spans and stuff. And oh look, I've got ADHD. I wonder what affected it or whatever. And my
Yeah.
daughter can't watch a film because it's too much of a commitment, and yet she'll watch hours and hours and hours. And then you go, how's that affecting you? So I think just think of the small practices that you do every single day that like make permanent, and be like, right, is it going to make the change that you want long term? And how do you just build on it gradually? So think of the things that you can stack on top of each other, and you get to this thing called habit stacking and whatever. But that's quite interesting. But I think distilling it down to very, very simplistic core thing that you can go like, what's a little thing that I can do like every day that just makes me feel, that just means that I can just be a little bit uncomfortable or whatever. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of kind of family and found family around me who have ND issues. I'm probably ADHD, but I've never been tested. But the number of people who've said to me, "You reckon?" But that's one of those things. But having observed people on all of those kind of areas and wider issues, I think the first thing that I think is been super useful is where there is leadership that acknowledges that stuff exists is a fundamentally
Oh yeah.
useful function. And as a leader, what I try to do is to help people understand the benefits as well as the restrictions that people are going to face, how that applies to the jobs that they do, and how we can accommodate so that we can get the best benefit for those people to be able to do their jobs. And what I found every single time when we've been able to pull that off has been that you get more effective teams, because when you have somebody who may be ASD based, perhaps they're more introverted, they will have more. They will often, not always, every individual is different, but they will often have more methodical, more process orientated ways of working.
Yeah.
Again, that's very generalizing, but forgive me for the short period of time we have. Similarly, with people who are more on the ADHD spectrum, they may be more iterative and pushing options. And again, very, very much differs between different people's ways of dealing with those processes. So I think understanding the individuals, giving them space to operate, understand how that can be a strength is something that I think the leadership need to do.
Yeah.
But also, I think acknowledging the nature of burnout, the nature of how, particularly, I'm thinking about social interaction,
Yeah.
especially post COVID. And my son's 25, but he had a period of quite significant social anxiety. Observing the impact on their energy levels from having extended social engagement, I think something that has really helped me understand that we've got to be careful about how we manage communications more effectively.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with all that, and I think there's like a lot of things in play like there, and I often think of like very simplistic like principles of around this sort of stuff of like better me plus better you equals better
Yeah.
everyone. So it's like, so there's the better me aspect of it, which is like, well, what am I doing? And then there's the better you, which is more about systems,
Yeah.
and that's more about teams and systems, and then beyond the systems is like the result of better everyone. So I think there's a lot that you have to think about, the things that you have control over, and you have control over, understanding your own self, like,
Yeah.
and so I would encourage more people to understand that. So understand your boundaries of discomfort, understand your boundaries, understand what it is that you're good at, and being humble isn't about downplaying your abilities and achievements. It's not. It's about recognizing them as like strengths and seeing how they fit into everything else. If I think game development is wonderful because it does suit lots of people with brains who work in different ways, because it just does. So I think there is you have a generalization of a lot of teams tend to work in certain ways, and it does suit certain brain types and everything. And I do think there definitely is a responsibility on, like, companies and teams to provide systems that just help understand that a bit more and point
And I
it
think this,
towards, and I think combining it with job satisfaction more than anything else. And so go back to when people are traditionally, when we started this conversation talking about, well, am I doing culture? Like,
yeah,
oh, I'm doing culture. I'm going to describe my values and describe
today
that.
I shall do
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. But do think about, like, do think about all these things. But what does it mean for, like, minority groups? What does it mean for, people on various different spectrums? What does it mean for someone who's got ADHD versus dyslexia versus,
Exactly.
whatever? And try and come up with those, and ask people for anecdotal evidence of it. And I think above all else is that you can get far into, like, the systems of stuff like this. And I think the thing that I would encourage people to think more about really is just creating the conditions for better feedback more than anything else. It's just being like, and so I think encouraging you to listen better is it sounds really potentially cliche or whatever, but yeah, you do have two ears and one mouth. So trying to get teams of people to really listen to each other more is like better. And I think sometimes there is a way of, if it's an uncomfortable situation or it's just a general situation, a general, like, chat with someone who's talking about, like, a struggle or talking about a way of working or whatever, like, you try and relate it, and you'll try and speak about someone that who has similar experiences. Oh yes, my cousin, or like,
Yeah,
yes, I feel that the same way, whatever. You're making it about you. Stop it. Like,
yeah,
give that person the space to talk about it. So don't stop trying to add value to it, and just ask them questions, as into, like, all right, well, how does that make how does that work, like, in practice, or like, how does it make you feel, or give me an example of that so I
yeah.
understand. And I would just encourage more leadership teams to, like, think about that.
And there's so many angles on this where, I mean, there are good reasons for doing it anyway as good people, but there's also solid commercial reasons for getting this stuff right as well. And I could spend the next hour chatting about the diversity values in particular. I mean, I've probably done that on previous podcasts. We always benefit, especially in games, but I think in any industry, when we have people who don't look like us in the room. But I'm going to go a different angle. So we've talked a lot about culture in general terms. I want to add in the Dunbar number. So Robin Dunbar, who talks about kind of how many people we can hold in our heads at one time at various degrees of connection.
Yeah.
I find it a really useful way of kind of indicating the scale points where organizational complexity kicks in.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, you might have a personal tribe of up to 150. Some people, maybe 200. You might have an extended network of, say, 500 people. You might have a more widely recognizable group that goes beyond that of around 1,500, but it becomes increasingly difficult to hold more information
Yeah.
about as many people, to have close and connected relationships, to have shared common experiences, the broader the circle. And to me, this absolutely shines through when we're looking at organizational structure. When I'm dealing with 5 to 10 people, maybe 15 people, I can manage that. I probably don't need any middle management. But when I get to 50 people, I absolutely need, it becomes unwieldy if there's not someone between me as a leader and them as the day-to-day people at the front edge. And
Yeah.
as we get to the stage where we've got 1,500, 15,000, hundreds of thousands of people, the complexity becomes exponential. How do you think about the way culture can help us with this scale problem?
So I think of there is a 20th century way of thinking about that, and there is a
Yeah,
21st century way of thinking about that. So the 20th century way, I feel like that's more what you're sort of describing, the traditional, and startups are always a great, there are always growing pains within them. So if up to 50 people, everybody knows each other's by first name and it's great, and then 50 to 150 get a certain organizational challenge, and then 150 onwards and whatever,
yeah,
just like you were describing there. So, and again, the whole like, well, we need more middle management. And what traditionally happens is as it grows, suddenly it becomes way too chaotic, and then they go, we need more people who understand how to manage and run large groups of people.
yeah,
They come in, and then everyone goes, don't like this because they're changing the way it's done and everything. And you go, yeah, but like, you have to mature as an organization and so forth like that.
yeah,
I like to think of it. There is maybe a different way of doing this, so you think of your traditional hierarchical organizational design, big pyramid. So
yeah,
people set strategy up here. People talk about how they disseminate that strategy, and people that do, like across the bottom, and that's what we think of. Go back to um, go back to thinking about optics and to how people communicate with each other and how complex that makes it. And think about it in that context as like if you were to optics is like a bubble that's floating around you, and then someone else has got a bubble that's floating around them. They're like, you're never really talking about the same thing. Like
mm,
you're just talking about optics.
yeah.
Imagine that in a massive organizational chart and
It's
everything
crazy, isn't
like
it?
that. Just
Yeah,
the way it pushes everyone around, everything like that. Instead, I'd like to think of it more as like a sort of a mess of sort of like small, robust teams that have like
yeah,
crazy amounts of autonomy. But that autonomy comes with a responsibility. So I like to think of things. I'm I'm working on like helping teams do this,
yeah,
but it's really hard.
mm,
Um, I think it's more. I like to think of it more like there is a 20th century way, and you think about the future of work. More and more AI is creeping into the way that everybody's. I'm so glad that we've got to what like 40 odd minutes to like before mentioning like AI. That more and more is creeping into like operational practices. Like there's more chat bars that mean you can just ask it something and it will just do for you. So we need less worker bees, and we need more people who just think, and we need people who think more creatively. And
yeah,
so I think of, so when you think of the future workplace and the future teams and what it is that they're capable of, how technology is going to influence them, actually the best teams are going to be people who have incredibly robust conversations around like what direction are we going, like to like minute detail, uh, and that is those conversations where that shit, do it again, and you're like, cool, I've just oh, okay, fine, I'm going to do that, and they're not holding it against you. So I
mm,
so I think of more around the training and the practices that enable people to just have incredibly honest conversations,
mm,
and think more like special forces teams than
yeah,
traditional hierarchical teams. So rather than thinking
yeah,
about management layers, it's more about, well, the if you have lots of autonomy, you have a crazy amount of responsibility. So you have to be able to, you have to be like almost like like well trained and
yeah.
highly capable and stuff like that. So
And the way I think of this is the differentiation. I'd rather than using 20th or 21st century because I think there were experiments like matrix organizations and things like that. But to me, it's a little bit like the kind of the GPU versus the CPU. The GPU is a central processor. It's kind of very linear. It's incredibly fast if it's done well, but the demand on the performance of that central unit is massive.
well,
Whereas when you're dealing with parallel processes, i.e., autonomous units that can run multiple operations simultaneously under a common endeavor,
yeah,
and I think culture unlocks that parallelism, for want of a better phrase.
well, yeah, well, yes, I do. Good culture, well articulated,
Yes.
like does. Like I suppose well articulated and well practiced, and and
And
something.
as you say, practice makes permanent.
Yeah, and it's just like what I use. So I mean, a simpler analogy sometimes is like you just think of traffic,
Mm.
like, and think of like how traffic jams work versus stoplights. And it's just kind of like it's not a are you waiting for permission, or are you looking for the signs and the gaps in which you can go? And one takes more awareness of being able to take in more information, and one is just focused on one thing. So I'd like to think of things like that and just kind of like, do you want a company that's just full of roundabouts where people navigate themselves, or do you want loads of stoplights? Like,
Mm.
yeah. So that's
And
another.
they do different things at
Yeah,
different scales.
yeah,
And adding a new lane doesn't always make things easier, but it will often alleviate, at least in the short term.
yeah.
Um, so I think this is the complexity. But I think the end of the day, what I find is if the leadership of an organization, the people who are ultimately responsible for the outcome of the whole organization, are willing to surrender their authority and uh, genuinely pass that to other people, to give people genuine autonomy, to give them genuine control, and set them goals, set them targets, but let them work out the best way to deliver for the organization's needs.
Hmm.
We're going to get better results. The
So,
question
question.
comes when that falls down, and how do you capture it?
Well, I think the one before that is what's stopping people doing that now.
Well, that's a good question. A lot of that, I think, is leadership fear as well.
So it's
It's
always
hard to give up.
it,
Delegation's hard.
it's an individual thing, and I think parents will recognize this a lot.
Mm,
Is that like it's your ego, it's your natural response, and
mm,
ego isn't necessarily always bad. It's just a protection mechanism, much as anything else. And we all have biases that do this. And I like to think of biases as it's just your brain being efficient. It's your brain just picking the path of like least energy to do this, and you're
yeah.
like, oh, actually, I probably need to work on this. Need to spend some more energy to sort of see these patterns differently, and so I change my natural responses,
Yeah.
like so.
Oh,
So I
Ella's told me off many a time because I know I could do that thing 10 times quicker and it's urgent and it's got to be done now. But if I take it away from that person,
yeah,
I will not only undermine their confidence, but they won't be able to do it themselves.
yeah, but the when you don't catch yourself doing that, you do
Yeah.
it and you just go, you convince yourself that you did a good job. You're like,
Yeah.
that felt good. I did that thing. It's awesome. And I see this a lot where there are people who are great operators who like they're so good at getting multiple things done, and they get elevated to a leadership position, like a much more senior leadership position, and their job becomes way more strategic. And they're like, your job is to figure out what not to do now.
Yeah.
Your job is to set the team's goals, set the team strategies, and you have to remove yourself from this.
Mm.
So you have to find a different way around this, and this it's very complex. So you're having to dismantle like your relationship with work and your identity with like
Yes.
with work, and you're like, but I was this. I was a programmer. I was a really competent I was good. I could do this stuff, and you go, it's not your job anymore. Like, and I think exposing people to those sorts of things are the things that that are super helpful. I think in all of
And
this.
not everybody is good at or wants to lead people. How do we make sure that those people who are really good at the thing that they do can still do it effectively, and those people who are better at helping people who are able to make that
Yeah.
different role, who have that authority? And I think that's a tough thing for any organization to get right.
I think, yeah. I mean, but I also think that we get too like bogged down in the semantics of what leadership is, and
Yeah.
like leadership's a skill, or it's this, or it's like what's the difference between management and leadership? Oh, and he's like, just no, just all of it. Fuck off. Like, just shut up. Like, it's just. I think I just try and simplify it as much as possible, and it's kind of like, well, and the simplest explanation, or the simplest, if you think of leadership as a job, You know, to go, its job is to create success. Like, and just go like, well, what's the success that this is creating? And you just have to. I would encourage people to more think about it through that, and it's like, and then you can start to put your layers of values and what makes you special on top of that, and you're like, well, what builds success through people? What builds success with them? What builds success aligned, that's not going to fuck the planet up, or like, or all these things. It's why, so I think, thinking of it in those terms more than anything else, just very simplistically, like is I think can only help people.
So I kind of was about to ask you the question, what would be the one piece of advice? I think you've just given it, but in case there's something else you want to add to that,
Yeah.
what is that one piece of advice you give people?
The one piece of advice I think it just sort of almost ubiquitous for everyone is I can't stress enough, just working on your own self-awareness. Like, spend time really thinking about the small stuff you do that stops people being honest with you. Like the stuff that, what is it, the things, do I understand my own strengths? Do I understand my own weaknesses? And do my teammates understand them? I think that is like, do the people around me understand my strengths and weaknesses? And am I able to articulate them and talk about them? And do people know what it is that I'm sort of working on, or what I'm trying to change or trying to. So I think the more that you can work on your self-awareness, the more that you sort of understand your own ego, and the more that you understand how that may frame any given moment you're in and whatever. So I think just the more that you can focus, I say more you can focus on, I think just picking intentional time to do it more than anything else. There you go. It's just picking some intentional time. So think about, how can I dedicate an hour a week to understanding my own strengths and weaknesses and helping my teammates understand my own strengths and weaknesses.
And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much. I think we've covered a whole bunch of areas around the principle of what culture is and what it isn't, that we are always doing it. Our very actions are doing it, and that it's our practices that become permanent. And if we've done that with intentionality, we will create processes that are going to enable other people and those around us to be more effective. But at the end of the day, as Simon says, if we don't spend time being self-aware, paying attention to the shadow that we cast, and making deliberate choices to ensure that we can improve the way that other people understand us and the way that we give them space to talk to us, we're not going to be able to do it effectively. And let's focus on simplification. At the end of the day, keep it simple. How do we make sure that we can create a great environment where people understand what's expected and how we can all work together to something great? And on that note, Simon, thank you very much. Is there a particular way that people can get hold of you if they want to find out more about what you're doing?
LinkedIn is probably the best one. So Simon Sparks, my face is on there. My game, I have a couple of Easter eggs in my profile. If you find them, then sort of like it's great to have a chat about them. So yeah, but yes, LinkedIn is the best place, really.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, on that note, this has been your Game Dev Local podcast. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe. If you've got any thoughts on culture, if you want to, question, argue, if you want to debate what we've been talking about, that's what the Discord's for. There's a great community out there on Discord. Please come and join us. Tell us what you do. And if you enjoyed it, as I say, like, subscribe, share, and we'll be back next time. We'll be talking about more things on my podquest to learn everything you want to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. Thank you very much.